welcome to tonight's emergency debate. The motion this evening is this House would rather have a strong dictatorship than a weak democracy. Speaking tonight for the proposition, we have Fadyazi Makere from Magdalene and Sanderson from Jesus. And for the opposition, we have Gerard Tully from Trinity Hall and Mike Black from Magdalene. Ooh. Okay. I'd now like to ask Fadyazi to open the case for the proposition.
Chaos or certainty? Economic instability or economic growth? Uprising or rising up? In short, ladies and gentlemen, would you rather a weak democracy or a strong dictatorship? From the outset, it's worth conceding that neither one of these forms of government is optimal. But if you had to opt for one, which would it be? I'll begin by defining the motion in the following terms. On the way to a more liberal regime in a country emerging from conflict or crisis, a strong dictatorship is preferable to a weak democracy. Now, one needs to ask, what is a strong dictator? Well, as opposed to an irrational or military dictator who kills or maims his own people, a strong dictator is powerful and decisive. He disallows dissenting voices and uses his or her own moral compass to decide upon important national issues as opposed to wide consultation. He is totalitarian, yet benevolent. A weak democracy, on the other hand, sounds like a charming idea at first, but deeper analysis shows that it is characterized by an idea of the will of the people, coupled with insufficient resources or inadequate access to information, which makes governmental policy chaotic and the country impossible to govern. A weak democracy lacks the institutions to implement democracy properly, for example, a strong and independent judiciary and a regulatory electoral commission. Such components are indispensable if a democracy is to be effective. And now that the motion is clearly defined, I will outline the three main premises of my argument. Firstly, a strong dictatorship is more likely to ensure political stability than a weak democracy. Secondly, a strong dictatorship is more likely to create an investment climate conducive to economic growth than a weak democracy. And a strong dictatorship is likely to be able to manage social, tribal, or ethnic tension, which is almost always characteristic of emerging, conflict-ridden, or developing states. I will deal with each of these matters in turn. A weak democracy does not offer enough political stability. Governments are frequently elected on and off, so there tend to be frequent changes in policy. Headline-grabbing protests and harsh criticism from the mass media are often enough to force sudden and unexpected change. Casting ballots in a weak democracy often amounts to a mere symbolic act, but citizens are still unable to demand vertical accountability from leaders. Kenya is a good example of this, and bears testimony to the ill effects of a weak democracy, which pays lip service to fundamental freedoms, while essentially unable to give true meaning or effect to them. Strong dictatorship, on the other hand, translates to swift and decisive action and well-managed crisis control. What do I mean by this? Let's take the example of Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda, referred to by the BBC as Rwanda's strongman. He's a strong dictator. According to The Economist, Kagame allows less political space and freedom of press than Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Reporters are frequently threatened, and even the BBC was suspended for criticizing him. His rule has been characterized by assassinations, enforced disappearances, arrests, imprisonment, and torture of both politicians and press critical of him. However, it's 15 years after the genocide in Rwanda and 7 years since Kagame assumed office. Kagame has actively assumed pro-business policies that have made Rwanda attractive to international companies and international funding organizations. Rwanda has shown year-on-year GDP growth of over 7% over the past 4 years. He's also been getting more international publicity lately, for everything he says is in vogue with current development thinking. He favors foreign investment over aid. Few random people would say anything negative about Kagame. He also downplays any ethnic agenda in Rwanda, presenting himself as a Rwandan and not a Tutsi, and has taken a strong line with elements accused of spreading any form of ethnic divisionism. This reinforces the idea that a strong dictator is more likely to be able to manage social, tribal, or ethnic tension, which is almost always characteristic of emerging, conflict-ridden, and developing state. It would not be unreasonable to suggest that free speech on the circumstances of the genocide that happened in Rwanda may have descended the nation back into chaos. One shudders to think how Rwanda would have turned out with a weak democracy. Rwanda is not an isolated example of this. Singapore has achieved the American dream, but not in the American way. It is a prosperous, clean city with imposing skyscrapers and glittering shopping centers. However, it was ruled by a strong dictator, you, who spent 41 years in power, only too short of Colonel Gaddafi. He imposed his laws on social behavior in Singapore. All in all, ladies and gentlemen, a decisive, totalitarian, yet benevolent hand is sometimes all you need, as the experiences of Rwanda and Singapore demonstrate. I urge you to carry the motion tonight, because people living in weak democracies will tell you that there are sometimes very pressing problems, including hunger, disease, illiteracy, and social tension, that simply living under a weak democracy and having the sham right to vote in an election wouldn't necessarily solve.
Thanks, Fadyazi. I'd now like to ask Mike to open the case for the opposition.
It's great to have the chance to speak tonight on such an important and relevant topic, because as the movement for freedom has taken hold in North Africa, it's led some to question their commitment to freedom, because of the problems that new democracies inevitably will face. But none of us would question that what we want for all nations, all people, is a strong and free democracy that we are so proud to have ourselves. We want stability and security for all people. And a dictatorship is not the way to achieve this. Democracy has its frustrations, its imperfections. It requires hard work, but it is worth that effort. It is a noble endeavour and one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. You cannot forget that this country was not born a stable and strong democracy. We had to begin weak, like all new democracies have to begin weak. We were allowed to ride the rocky road. Not just yet, thank you. Ride the rocky road to freedom, and we should not condemn new democracies in their embryonic state and be so selfish as to say that they cannot have the chance to achieve what we have achieved. The leading speaker for the proposition has said that a dictatorship can be a way of achieving a liberal state. Consider, ladies and gentlemen, the rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of assembly, and what happens to these rights when they are left in the hands of unchecked power. They are immediately endangered, sentenced to death almost, because when it is convenient to do so, dictators can usurp and infringe upon these rights, and it is always convenient for dictators to do this. Even our own government, in the wake of 9/11, in the interest of national security, tried to do things which would infringe upon and usurp human rights. Our democracy, our judiciary puts checks in place. We prevented their worst excesses, stopped them going further. But this can never work for dictators. And dictators, however stable, however benign they may look for now, will inevitably not be able to be held in the high esteem of their people for eternity, whether they rule through the cult of personality or through fear. One day, their people will get sick of them. In this new age of globalization and the internet, when people of all nations can see the rights that we, the free democracies, have, they want it for themselves. This creates tension within the system. And without the valve of the ballot box and elections to release people's dissatisfaction with their government, tension is created in the system. Friction arises. Yes, please. the moment it solves that problem. History has not completely run its course in China. They cannot suppress every single instance of free speech. The Jasmine Revolution, which is currently on the internet, of course, is weak at the moment. China is a unique exception to the rule because of its strong, stable economy for now. But one day, yes, sorry.
What you make your take is China has a strong and stable economy. That's a good thing about it.
Economy is a great thing about it, but the people of China do not have freedom of expression, and their rights are frequently infringed upon on a regular basis. Dictatorship, for the most part, in almost every instance, because of the problems of not having a peaceful transition available to them, is an inevitable route to chaos. It may work in the short term, but in the long term, it cannot create the permanent stability that a democracy can create. Democracy can be frustrating. It has many problems. Winston Churchill said the greatest argument against democracy was a 5-minute chat with the average voter. This is an elitist notion, but we can see it for ourselves. When George W. Bush was re-elected leader of the free world, we can feel that frustration. But these real concerns do not outweigh just how amazing it is that we have the right to select our own legitimate leaders. And we've had to go through some difficult times, but we should want all people of all nations to be able to have this right in the end. If nothing else should convince this House to reject this motion, then cast your mind outside of the Cambridge bubble we all inhabit and can get lost in at times, and think about the people sacrificing themselves, shedding their own blood just 10 miles from Tripoli this evening. What would they think if we were not to reject this motion? We should stand firmly behind them and reject the motion of this emergency debate.
Now's the part where we open the debate up to the floor. Please keep speeches to 1 minute and give your name and college before you start. For those of you who've come in late or weren't really listening, the motion is this House would rather have a strong dictatorship than a weak democracy. Would anyone like to start with a speech for the proposition? Yeah.
Hi, Razavi Emmanuel College. I think there's an illustrative example to be seen in Pakistan, which over the past decade has shown us both a strong dictatorship and a weak democracy in the form of Assad Zardari. And I think most people who look at this scenario would definitely agree that under Musharraf we had times of economic prosperity, stability, etc. And under the puppet regime of Zardari, which is, he's more or less unelected, because in a country where the education is so poor and where there's so much external influence on elections anyway, it's difficult to see how we've improved under a weak democracy compared to the strong dictatorship we had previously.
And for the opposition?
There seems to be a logical fallacy in the opposition's argument, in the proposition's argument, which is that, okay, you have a country that gives economic growth and it's totalitarian. The problem is, if you have a business community emerging, how can it remain totalitarian? Once you have a strong business class that can bring economic growth, it is no longer totalitarian and, according to their definition, no longer strong.
And an abstention? Yes.
College. There's been strong examples of where weak democracies have gone horribly wrong. At the same time, there's quite a famous example in Nazi Germany, where you had quite a horrific, strong government. And yes, it made Germany very strong, but look at the consequences.
Another speech and proposition?
Ruben Schwartz, Dominic Keys College. The opposition has completely neglected, they've been brainwashed by the propagandist, democratist education. which we have in this country and has completely ignored the benevolent dictatorships of the 18th and 19th centuries.
And in opposition?
Emmanuel College. I don't know whether I agree with the idea of there being a benevolent dictator, or you could argue that perhaps they do exist, but the inevitable problem that you have is that in investing so much power into one person, once they inevitably either get too old for their position or die or whatever, the country's then left in an even weaker position where you might not have such a benevolent person taking over. Therefore, surely a democracy is always a better option.
And in abstention? Yep, on the end of the bench.
Terry Dalton, Trinity College. The opposition, although it was a very fine speech, generally tended to weigh up dictatorship against democracy. And I didn't really see the difference between the terms strong and weak in the argument. And I'd just like to ask both sides to define what exactly is a strong democracy. Is a strong democracy where there aren't huge majorities in the Houses of Government, and ideas are hotly debated and ideas exchanged and the best possible policies hammered out? Or is a strong democracy one where there is an overwhelming mandate in which decisions get taken quickly? I don't think there's been a distinction drawn between a strong democracy and a weak democracy, or a strong dictatorship and a weak state, or a strong dictatorship and a weak dictatorship. So can the speakers please make this distinction in their second speeches?
Okay, one last speech for the proposition. Blue jumper.
Sanderson, Clare College. The gentleman up there mentioned the example of Nazi Germany. However, I feel he neglected to say that the Nazis actually came to power via a democratic process, and were the result of a troubled democracy, shall we say, which failed to recognise the distinctions of friend-enemy relations and allowed such an abomination to get in. Whereas if we had a benevolent dictatorship in the first place, this would not have happened.
And for the opposition? At the back.
Down in College. I would ask, the argument of the proposition seems to be that life under a stable dictator is good because of things like economic growth and better than under a weak democracy. But I ask you guys, everybody in this room, how much would you sell your freedom of speech for? I wouldn't sell it for anything. A strong economic situation doesn't make up for my lack of rights.
And an abstention?
Josh Silverstein, St. John's College. The argument here is we would prefer a strong dictatorship over a weak democracy, but we haven't discussed, and neither of the speakers discussed, the metric against which we would prefer this. What we would prefer it because of X. So the proposition clearly prefers it because of economic growth, and the opposition clearly is against it because of fundamental rights. That's the debate that needs to be had over which our society prizes more.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to ask Joe to finish the case for the proposition.
Thank you. Let's get one thing straight to start with. The ideal is a strong democracy. On that note, I would like to remind you that if you want to be part of the Union's strong democracy, get your nomination forms and manifestos in by 6 p.m. tomorrow. But, moving on, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a strong, stable country ruled by an autocrat, or a weak country plagued by instability that happens to have elections. That is the issue in this debate. And my point, ladies and gentlemen, is that elections are irrelevant if government is powerless. A weak democracy is not really ruled by the people who happen to be elected. It's ruled by the mobs, it's ruled by criminal gangs. And an example of that would be Afghanistan. Yes, in theory it's democratic, it has elections, but it's a weak democracy. In reality, the people who rule are the drug cartels, the warlords, the Taliban, and Mexico, again, a weak democracy. You have a drug war, you have thousands of people dying every year. And from the floor we heard about Pakistan, which displays the same pattern. When it had a dictator, it was prospering. When it's had a weak democracy, it's collapsed into instability and is now considered by many to be a failed state. But yes, contrast that to a country with a strong government which isn't democratic. And the prime example, I think, today would have to be China. Of course, there are human rights abuses. You can have dictatorships that, for the most part, respect rights. What's more, there is one right that comes above all others, and that is the right to live. This is a question. Would you rather die in a weak democracy or live in a strong dictatorship? Ladies and gentlemen, the characteristics of a weak democracy are violence in the streets, a complete lack of safety, and no real government. Now, while I'm in favour of some limits on government, I think we can all, unless Christian Gowers is here, agree that total anarchy is not a desirable state. And that is what a weak democracy is. In reality, it's anarchy. You don't have a government that works. And what this motion asks you to do is to choose the lesser of two evils. We on this side would love it if everywhere could have a strong democracy that supports human rights. But in our submission, it is better to live with a dictatorship than die with weak democracy. Human rights depend on governmental protection. Strong dictatorships protect some rights well. Weak democracy protects all rights really badly. Ladies and gentlemen, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the US Declaration of Independence, he said that all men have certain rights, and that amongst them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's a reason why he put life first. Without life, you can't have freedom of speech. You can't have the freedom to protest. If you're dead, you can't vote. Because strong dictatorships protect life and weak democracies don't, I would prefer that if I were faced with that awful choice between the two, I would live in a strong dictatorship and not die in a weak democracy. I hope you, like me, will support the motion. And it's worth pointing out that the UK's strong democracy grew from a strong monarchy, which is in effect a strong dictatorship. And with that, I would like to beg you to support the motion, and I'll hand over to someone running for Kusu office to back weak democracy.
I'd now like to ask Gerard to finish the case for the opposition.
I was really worried I was going to have to give some rebuttal, but thankfully I don't have to dignify the ridiculous live or die thing with a response. The first prop made a couple of points about strong dictatorship. She said, likely to manage social and ethnic tension. I just wrote Yugoslavia, Cambodia, Libya. She also said it's likely to create a strong and stable climate for investment. Again, I just wrote Belarus, the last dictatorship and the poorest country in Europe, Kazakhstan, some of the highest inequality in the world. Is that really what we want to aspire to? On a dark and rainy night, at least I imagine it was raining, in autumn 1821, a crowd of people like us were crowded around Not in this chamber, but above a bar somewhere, holding a union debate. It might have been on, "This House believes the government of Lord Liverpool will be forgotten by history." Someone got it. However, it was then that the university authorities came in and shut the union down. The story is relevant because then the university was essentially run like a benevolent dictatorship. The proctors and the senior fellows of the university exerted huge control over all affairs of students, enough to shut down a private society. Now, the fellows of the university now are voting on whether to reject this university's plans to cut bursaries. Times change. Control and power flow from being centralised to being diffused. When a country enters a democratic model, it almost always implies the relaxation of free speech rules on the surveillance of their people and the force regimes use to impose control. Unlike a dictatorship whose primary energizer is the use of power to remain in power, democracies develop and learn as they go on. They do not stagnate as they battle to remain in control over the will of the people, because a genuine, functioning democracy counts on that to begin with. No. If we're going to talk about weak democracy over strong dictatorship, we have to remember the innate potential that a democracy has to become better and place that in context. Every member of the G8 is a democracy. Now, these countries are not weak, they are strong, but they were not always so. No. All experienced a painful period of weak democracy, often in chaos, and through trial and error, low and high points, they have developed and flourished as open and free nations. And this is principally because democracy has the capacity to inspire and to energise. Opening up the doors of power means casting a wider net for the talent and the skills any developing country needs, right across the board. Yes?
In 1991, Somalia had a weak democratic state take power. Where is Somalia now? It's the biggest classic example of a failed state. If a strong dictatorship had entered power in 1991, we may have a different scenario in Somalia today.
I will address that because you're quite right. The problem with weak democracy is that we do not support it. But, and I will come to it, the democratization of knowledge is what I was about to talk about, and it's kind of related. It empowers people to develop themselves, and it makes life better for them and their families. Democracy tends to imply a more meritocratic system, and we know from experiences everywhere, including in this country, that when the barriers to social inequality and division are removed, people are happier, the economy is on a sounder footing, and those with the best talent to make money or can create great culture can work freely and succeed. A strong dictatorship, no thanks, I'm running out of time, is anathema to the very idea of meritocracy, because it must favour some over others as political calculations dictate to maintain a grip on power. Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, no. Always young and enterprising populations, all of which could not be contained or find their voice in a dictatorship, for this very reason. Okay, go on.
Isn't China a member of the G8?
No. I believe democracy works and is a more preferable system of government because it is dynamic and can always improve. It does so because it uniquely reaches out and involves ordinary people by giving them the choice to vote, to criticise, to stand for election themselves if they like. It forces this dynamism that can be such a strong conduit for change. You see that now across the Middle East. Weak democracy, under the conditions where it is nourished and flourishes and supported, provides the best opportunity for people to live their lives as they want to. It is ridiculous that in 2011 you should support this motion. They are on the wrong side of history. Be on the right side when you vote tonight. Thank you.
Proposition, shout aye, and when I ask for votes for the opposition, shout nay. Now make it really clear, guys, because often it's a bit fuzzy and in the middle. Okay, votes for the proposition. Aye! Votes for the opposition? Nay!